Okay, should we? All right. So we are going to go into a new unit today. And obviously, we've been doing a lot of ethical theories that prescribe conditions for right action. Now, I've called them principles of deliberation for the whole course, right? Some of these may be in your unit, others might not be, right? But let's take the act utilitarianism and Kantian ethics just as core areas to sort of contrast here, right? So the act utilitarian says an act is morally required just because it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances, right? So we're always acting to produce good, right? But again, number five, as an ethical theory, that principle of deliberation is evaluates the unit of action. So what is the right action? And again, even in Kantian ethics, right, we just learned, even with the two versions of the categorical imperative that work side by side, right? You're giving yourself a moral law to the fact that no one can make an exception of that, and that reason you give yourself is also something that can't use other people without their consent, right? So you have a sort of principle of humanity and you're still giving yourself reasons. So Kantian ethics offers us two principles that serve as the ultimate test for morality. But still, Kantian ethics is about evaluating the right type of action. So within virtue ethics, the word virtue should send a clear signal. The word virtue means reliable characteristics of the person that they display in action, right? So think about when you tell a story of someone, when you're recommending a class to somebody else and you say, is this professor a disciplinarian? Is he really hard? Is this professor too easy? Um, is there a professor that you could recommend me that has both a structure but is not too rigid in terms of that structure? So what characteristics that people display? And by virtues, usually we don't necessarily mean how someone conducts a class, but when you're asking to take a professor, you're asking about whether he or she is the type of person that would be a good fit for how you learn. And are they the virtuous type of professor? So consider honesty, a certain virtue. Some professors I've had over the course of the years in my own education, they couldn't give it to me straight. And they would say the things that they wanted to say. So rather than saying like, hey, your paper doesn't really develop the topic very well, um, maybe they would say something like that, but really honestly, your thesis statement really kind of sucks here, right? Sometimes people don't tell you what you really need to be told in the right type of way. So they lack some sort of judgment about the context, right? So sometimes people are cowardly and they don't have a virtue at all, right? The virtue is completely gone. But the point is, when you start talking about virtues, you're not really talking about units of right action. You're talking about what type of people we ought to be. And so, this section of this unit, virtue ethics, any virtue ethical tradition is talking about not being not the right type of action, but being the right type of person. And what a person does is that they respond to a context or an action by manifesting the right type of virtue in relationship to that context, right? So, and this is going to have a completely different flavor to it, right? So, uh, so all of these theories have what are called standards of right action, right? But virtue ethics asks, what type of person should I be? Does the character of a person matter? Right? So here's the case of the police officer from our reading. The case of the police officer. Consider a police officer that obeys the law, but only reluctantly. He always does the minimum required of him. If he could get away with it, he would extort money from business owners on his beat, brutalize prisoners, and doctor evidence. He doesn't actually do any of these things, but that's because he's afraid of what would happen if he were caught. So some people are constrained by rules, but if they could act in relationship to those rules, they're the type of person that would undermine them at the first chance that they could get. And so if that's really true about some people, it might make sense to talk about ethics, not necessarily in terms of like right action, but whether or not they're actually the right type of person. So virtue ethics, rather than ask what type of action is right or wrong, like what action is right or wrong, the virtue ethicist is simply talking about what type of person should I be? Should I have been more courageous? Should I have been more honest? Should I not have been as honest? Right? So virtue ethics takes a different look at ethics because virtue ethicists begin by considering what makes for a desirable human life, and specifically, they examine what conditions and character traits are necessary for such a good life, right? So usually when I teach this in the physical classroom, I have my students, I said, okay, if you were to raise a child right now and you wanted them to live a flourishing life, what type of character traits would you think your children should have? And so you could pause the video for a second and sort of ask, like, make a list. Pause to consider. Okay, so in the list you may or may not have just made, did you have things like, I want them to be honest, right? I want them to be courageous. I want them to be charitable. I want them to be generous. Like, what is on your list? Maybe you disagree with just some of the virtue traits I said, but a virtue ethicist is dedicated to the idea that people are formed, right? And sometimes it doesn't really make sense to talk this way because we think of morality a lot in terms of like, did you do good? Is your action good, right, or wrong, right? Even the right or wrong vocabulary applies to the action level unit of analysis, but not necessarily someone's character. So, and what the standard of right, but even though there's not a standard of a principle of deliberation that talks about action, we can still sort of frame virtue ethics in this way where we do have a principle of deliberation, right? So VE, an action is morally right just because it's one that a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So in this unit, we have this notion of the moral exemplar, right? Moral exemplars are ideal virtuous persons that serve as a role model for the rest of us. Now, before you're thinking like, I just got off the phone with a really good friend of mine. I was thinking about how to frame a particular course for spring 2023 if it's approved, right? I sort of want to do this one thing, but I'm thinking like, how do I arrange the course in such a way that young people at an HBCU might respond to it? And the course is African American philosophy and religious thought. And my friend has gone to HBCUs from undergrad all the way to his doctorate. And I sort of talked to Anthony and I say, Anthony, would this have worked at your HBCU when you were younger? And, here are the assumptions. Now, he also teaches philosophy. So he's a really good friend of mine, but he is a moral exemplar for me to talk about how to teach philosophy in an institutional setting. And even though I've been in the HBCUs for 6 years, I still want to have responsible pedagogy. I still talk about what it means to be a virtuous teacher in the setting that I'm in, right? So in that way, when you think about any type of mentoring relationship, like spiritual mentors or priests or people that you confide in, right? You might have a mentor, and the reason they're their mentor is not necessarily because they know a lot about the field that they're training you to do. I mean, obviously that's one way, but a good mentor also is kind of like an idealization of that particular type of occupation. Like I picked a really great philosophy friend to have, right? And he's also, when I navigate these contexts, I want to make sure that I'm doing right by both, his field of expertise is African American philosophy. I'm competent in that field, but I'm not necessarily an expert, and I'm acquiring expertise by arranging a course and teaching it. And some of the things I have done in African American philosophy have merely been on like Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. So, and I have read some notions of Black liberation theology, but I've never really taught them before. And so you could sort of talk to your mentors, but your mentors are picked because they are exemplars to you at that time. And there might even be a time period where you grow past those mentors, where you acquire more virtue than they do. And then you become the mentor of someone who's younger. But this also builds into the idea that when we're talking about exemplars, right, they can be the idealization of human achievement. We might even look at, say we're Christian, we might actually look at the teachings of Jesus Christ, not necessarily as a set of rules, but maybe we think that Jesus is a standard of human life that's achievable by humans. And that might be the reason why God became human in the Christian tradition, right? But also, Jesus might be a moral exemplar. He's ideally virtuous, right? So since the principle of virtue ethics may be too general to use at times, and that's kind of like here, and I do think that it is kind of ambiguous, but oftentimes the virtue ethicist is going to bite the bullet and say, like, look, oftentimes there are no clear rules to engage rightness or wrongness, but there is maybe a range of applicability as to how we might manifest a certain virtue in response to a certain situation. So they take on the generality and ambiguity of moral life because that's the reason they're virtue ethicists, because they disagree with the right action theorists like Kant or utilitarians that morality is codifiable at all. In fact, morality should be more about wisdom, phronesis, and oftentimes the people who are really great at figuring out what the ideal virtue should be are the people that have acquired the expertise of living a certain life or living a certain virtue in a similar context that you don't know what to do. I mean, young people come to us all the time asking us like, hey, I'm in this class, I have to write this paper, I've never written this paper before, Dr. H. How would you go about approaching it? And, I've been in school for like, took me 12 and a half years. And then during that time, I've had my PhD for 9 years, and I've been a professor at 11 different universities. So I know how to student well. So you might look to me as a moral exemplar in a very small way as to like how to do academics well. All right. And sure, I can advise students on those specific things, right? Now, we reference the moral rules to figure out what we ought to do. When they conflict, we go to an example. We go to someone who might have moral wisdom. Now, some virtue rules: do what is honest, act loyally, display courage, deal justly with others, right? Be fair, have fairness, show wisdom, be temperate, avoid gluttony, refrain from infidelity, don't be timid, lazy, stingy, or careless, free yourself from prejudice, and so on. The disagreement about so these are some virtue rules. So it's not to say that morality is completely uncodifiable, but the virtue ethicist is motivated about a skepticism that morality can be so formulaic that both Kant and Mill can find a supreme one moral principle to sort of rule and codify all of human life, because moral life is more messy to the virtue ethicist, right? So the messiness is actually covered in this like next section, right? Moral complexity. So there are no formulas to figure out what our moral duty is in any specific situation, right? So here's an example, the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So we must not expect the same degree of precision in all areas of study. And that's something that Aristotle says, right? And that implies morality lacks rules and methods of thinking that are as precise as those, say, in mathematics. Now, what you might say is that the utilitarian or the Kantian did try to make morality so structured and coherent and rational that they think of morality as discovering mathematical truths. That's not too far off the the path here, right? So here is an argument from what I call ethical precision in your notes. This is my own creation. So premise one, the problem with the golden rule is that even a child can use it with authority, right? So Aristotle says, right, and this is kind of a weird, strange quote. It's one of my more favorite quotes from Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about virtue ethics, right? But even the youth, while drunk, can recite the verses of Empedocles. That's the quote. And what Aristotle is saying is like, look, people may even memorize the beauty of this one poet, but it takes a lifetime to really appreciate what the deep meaning of that poetry could be, right? So children fall short of life experiences necessary to have moral wisdom. Premise three, having moral wisdom requires emotional maturity and sound judgment, and these take time to develop, which by definition children do not possess. So four, therefore, adhering to a simple formulaic rule like the golden rule or the utilitarian principle or the categorical imperative cannot explain the complexity of moral life, right? Because moral life is messy, it's complicated, and it does require a level of wisdom that takes time to develop. So virtue ethicists invite us to appreciate the moral complexity of life. Consider a thought experiment, right? Imagine a moral rule book. The book would contain all the true rules of ethics and all the precise methods for applying them, right? And say they very much are true. It would state when exceptions were called for and when they were forbidden. It could be applied in a mechanical way without any need of judgment. So the question is, in imagining this rule book, is that even something that could possibly be? So the question of this thought experiment is the moral rule book possible to frame, to create, and to have? And if you're inclined to the intuition no, right? If you're that inclined, then saying that morality is complex does not mean that everything's up for grabs. The principles, methods, and results of moral theory, right? Hang on. All right. So saying that morality is complex doesn't mean that everything's up for grabs. The principles, methods, and results of moral theory might be general, but they're not a matter of opinion such that everybody's moral view is as good as another, right? Aristotelians state it might be a gray area, but within the gray, there are a few kind of objective things, right? There is something like being too brave to the point where you're reckless and an adrenaline junkie and you endanger your Marine recon unit to the point that you reveal your location to the enemy because, right, everyone has to sort of be on the same page, right? So Aristotelians believe in objective standards of morality, those that are true independently of personal feelings and opinions, but they think that the truth of morality is in developing the virtues to respond to those situations that call for them, right? And so it's the application of the virtue and what it means to act courageously within a certain situation. But it does not necessarily mean that, when you are, in a recon unit in the Marines, you do have to have the level of virtue of courage, right? And if you don't have any courage whatsoever and you're in a recon unit, that also can be disastrous for the particular what you're doing in the military, right? Now, moral understanding is a species of practical wisdom, right? Now, there are other forms of practical wisdom out there, and we're going to use this phrase practical wisdom. In fact, practical wisdom is what the term phronesis picks out, right? And a person of moral wisdom, right? So this is practical wisdom. A person of, how do we say this? A person of, that's a moral exemplar, they are called a phronimos, right? those are the Greek terms coming from Aristotle that sometimes get associated with these terms. So if you're reading other literature or you're going to like secondary sources and you see these words, they're used in conjunction with virtue ethics. So what types of practical wisdom are there? You could fix a car, you could put together IKEA furniture, something that inevitably happens after your undergraduate year. You can't afford really nice furniture, so you will, if you're living in a city with an IKEA, you will have to put it together. It's kind of a rite of passage of everyone with a bachelor's degree. Knowing how to play a musical instrument, that's a level of practical wisdom, right? So moral wisdom is a kind of know-how that requires a lot of training and experience. Book smarts and a high IQ don't help in relation to moral wisdom. Just because you're book smart doesn't actually mean that you're a virtuous person, right? And just because you might have a high IQ and it doesn't necessarily mean you're a moral person. Years ago, there was a movie with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck where he is a genius and he's a janitor at Harvard, Matt Damon, and he could be the most famous mathematician, and he has a really high IQ, but he's just young and naive about certain elements of life. And so the actor Robin Williams plays a therapist at a community college who helps him become a better person. And you could say, oh God, what's this movie called? Right? I forget what the title of the movie is, but it's the type of movie that tells a story of right. It is called Good Will Hunting, right? But and it was one of Ben Affleck's movies that won an Oscar. It was a really great drama, and it's a really great movie. But it's a movie that is largely the story of virtue ethics, right? Uh, Matt Damon's character, while a genius, does not know what it means to love. He doesn't necessarily know how to process the sexual abuse that he received, right? And he has to come to terms with that, right? And he pushes away someone that he really much loves. And so I won't ruin the movie for you, but at the end of the movie, um, his therapist and mentor, or the moral exemplar of the movie, the Phronimos, is Robin Williams. And Robin Williams looks at the note, won't tell you what the note says, and he says, "The SOB stole my life." And he smiles, right? Because he's really happy for Matt Damon. So it's one of those really, really great movies. So in relationship to moral wisdom, right, there are three capacities of moral wisdom that we can sort of see. And we do have to talk about how we develop our emotions and how we develop these traits, right? So emotions can help us see what is morally relevant by tipping us off of what matters in a given situation. So fear can signal danger, for instance, right? Compassionate people will miss things that others will miss in a certain situation. The second thing is emotions can help us tell us what is right or wrong. So if we are virtuous, the anxiety we feel when considering certain actions is excellent evidence that these actions are immoral, right? So emotions can tell us what's right and wrong sometimes, right? In fact, virtue ethicists sometimes believe that there's wisdom in terms of analyzing the emotions of people within certain contexts, right? And also emotions help to motivate us to do the right thing. So knowing the right thing to do is one thing, but having the follow through in order to actually achieve your end or to be courageous or whatever the virtue in question is. So the question here is, how do you develop moral virtues, right? Certainly, we could talk about moral wisdom, but can moral wisdom be learned? And to some extent, yes. So moral understanding can be gained by training, experience, and practice, right? Without practice, these traits and capacities can only lead to appropriate action every once in a while. And what we want from the virtue ethicist perspective, we want people to develop virtues that are consistently courageous, right? So if talk about the fictitious Marine in the recon unit, and they're moving stealthily in the mountains of Afghanistan, uh, and one of the Marines, starts whistling when they're supposed to be silent, and he doesn't know when he should listen, right? Or maybe he wants to invite danger, so he starts whistling, right? And it's kind of revealing the position because it's thought that insurgents they're moving up the mountain very stealthily because maybe there's an enemy cave up there with supplies in it, right? Or something like that. So If you display virtue unreliably, you can't display the virtue reliably over time in the situation that calls for it, then you need to be trained or habituated to manifest that virtue when you can and act in a certain way, right? So virtue is not inborn, it takes time to acquire. It also takes the right sort of environment and teachers. So upbringing plays a crucial role, right? So if you're talking about youth groups, like in a church, for instance, right, you might talk about how people are formed in their relationship with Christ. But all of that is taught within the language of what is called formation. So how are people formed, right? So if you go to Catholic school or private school, right? Um, Maybe it's even a Baptist school, but the language of formation, how are people formed and what are we teaching them becomes a central concern. Uh, Oftentimes secular schools don't actually do a really good job of painting why it is that we should be secular or what morality is, so maybe some schools do it better than others, but this is actually in philosophy of education, this is a problem. Like, should curriculum include in it elements of moral understanding and formation like the religious counterpart schools, right? And because virtue is not inborn and everyone recognizes that you need to learn how to become virtuous, how do schools contribute to the development of children to become citizens in the country that they're in, right? So if you're raised in a corrupt society, that'll hinder one's ability to be virtuous, right? If you're raised in a society that takes on that burden, maybe it's going to be better. And we begin as apprentices in moral education to acquire moral wisdom. So here's a quote from the book. Think about how apprentices in other areas are trained. An apprentice in a professional kitchen begins with a list of do's and don'ts, right? A set of hard and fast rules over time, and she learns the limits of these rules, when to honor and when to break them, right? So there's no master rule book to be like a great chef, but you learn through making mistakes. So let's talk about the nature of virtue. So the ultimate goal of moral education is to make ourselves better people. And the ultimate goal of making ourselves better people is to become as virtuous as we can. So making ourselves better means someone who is better at being courageous, just, or being temperate when the situation calls for it. But so what is a virtue? And as I've defined it, a virtue is a reliable character trait displayed over time in one's actions. Or you could just go simply with virtue is a character trait. It's a characteristic of a person. So a character trait is a reliable trait that's the appropriate manner to respond to a situation in some way. A virtue is not a habit. Habituation is required to form virtues, but a virtue is not reducible to a habit. So some people are habitually loyal, but they don't understand the appropriateness as to why they should be loyal in some circumstances and maybe not loyal in other circumstances, right? So Schaefer-Landau gives an example of generosity. So a generous person has different thoughts of those of an ungenerous person, right? Or selfish person. And two, they have different motivations from the ungenerous person. A generous person is not begrudging of their time as a stingy person might be. But the virtuous person is defined both by their actions in their inner life, right? And what virtues people see, believe, and feel things that are vicious people, right? So take that as a grain of salt. So what Schaefer-Landau is saying here is uh, a generous person is not just habitually generous, right? A generous person will know the circumstances where their generosity will manifest virtue, right? A courageous person will know that you're not just courageous all the time, right? Some people are just over the top courageous, to the point where it's a level of stupidity, right? My friends once held me back from fighting the whole football team because the football team was picking on my friends and I didn't like it. And I didn't think that there was like 8 football players who were like over 150 pounds, like some 200, right? They were just looking at me at the age of 17, 18 as I was threatening the whole table. Now, when my friends held me back and they tell me this story, what they don't know is I was actually betting on the fact that none of them were actually going to fight me and that they would just back down from, and, I could say that now, but like I was a little hot-headed as a young man, so that was not necessarily the best way to solve that problem. but oftentimes the errors of our youth are answered by the ignorance of other people who were relating to at that time. So I don't ever know if it was virtuous or not facing down that table. Now, the reason why people are virtuous is that there is something called the good life, right? Um, and since I've been talking for a half hour, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video and I will start here at virtue and the good life. But now that you got sort of the shape of the theory, this is halfway through the lecture and I only like to do half-hour videos, give or take. So I'll do another one that sort of closes this section up. So, okay.